While the West is being destroyed from the inside by an autoimmune disease, also known as collective guilt syndrome, it simultaneously faces a number of external, increasingly aggressive totalitarian forces, most prominently that of radical Islam. And on the frontier of this conflict, both militarily and ideologically speaking, we find Israel. In this video series, I'm going to address the most common arguments and points of criticism used against Israel with regards to its current operation in Gaza and its actions towards its enemies as a whole. I will demonstrate how most of this criticism is either deceptive or logically incoherent, and one argument at a time, I will give you the most precise and concise way to dismantle those arguments completely. Without further ado, I give you the case for Israel. Now let's turn to the second part of the displacement myth, namely the very common claim that Israel is deliberately evicting Palestinians from their homes because of their ethnicity specifically, which of course is not true. And in a moment, I'm going to tell you why. First, however, I have to say that the settler movement is such a complex issue and requires more explanation than there is time for in this video. I'm therefore going to do an entire separate video on the settler movement. Don't worry. In the meantime, I'm going to focus on the one event that most people in recent days tend to be referring to when they're talking about the eviction of Palestinians. The event which started the so-called May 2021 Gaza conflict, namely the eviction of Palestinian families from their homes in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in East Jerusalem. And here is how it's gonna go down. First, I'm going to present you with a few facts and then a reminder of what everybody says about the conflict. Then afterwards, I'm going to tell you what actually happened. So in 2021, an Israeli court ruled that several Palestinian families living in Sheikh Jarrah could be evicted and that Jewish settlers had valid claims to the properties. This decision was part of a decades-long legal battle over property ownership in this area. Of course, Palestinian families living there argued that they had lived in their homes for generations, and they rejected the settlers' claims, leading to widespread anger and protests. The eviction orders triggered protests from Palestinians in East Jerusalem, particularly in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood itself, all of which led to a sharp escalation in tensions between Palestinians and Israeli authorities, which quickly led to widespread unrest and violence. In response to the situation in Sheikh Jarrah and the violence at Al-Aqsa, Hamas, the militant group controlling Gaza, issued warnings to Israel and eventually began launching rockets toward Israeli cities, including Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. Israel responded to the rocket fire with airstrikes on Gaza, targeting Hamas infrastructure. This led to an 11-day military confrontation between Israel and Hamas, as always resulting in widespread destruction in Gaza and significant casualties on both sides. Now, these evictions, they were seen as a broader effort by Jewish settler organizations to change the demographic balance in East Jerusalem, a highly contentious issue due to its significance for both the Israelis and the Palestinians. And you would very likely have been fed this narrative had you followed the news surrounding this issue back in 2021. The claim that the Israelis have deliberately been throwing out Palestinians to change the demographics of East Jerusalem is an extremely common and widespread claim. And it is an opinion that stirs up a lot of anger, especially among Palestinians, as many Palestinians today regard East Jerusalem as a potential capital for a future Palestinian state. And why would the Israelis just throw people out of their homes? That's gotta be for malevolent reasons, right? Actually, no. The truth is that what really happened in Sheikh Jarrah is something which, if it had happened anywhere else in the world, most people would have been completely okay with it. Namely, people getting evicted largely for not paying their rent. Since it happened in Israel, since it was done by the Israelis, of course, hell broke loose. Now, of course, there is a broader historical context to this. It's not that simple. But the fact remains, as you shall see in a moment, that it was completely legitimate for the Israelis to evict these people. And all of this, rather than being the fault of the Israelis, was actually to a larger extent the fault of the Jordanians. But to understand why, we have to go back to the first Arab-Israeli War of 1948. One of the consequences of this war was, of course, that Jordan conquered East Jerusalem. Many Jews lived in East Jerusalem. Many owned property there. And after the war, all the Jews living in East Jerusalem were expelled with force and without compensation. On what basis? On the basis of being Jewish. In other words, if you're looking for an example of illegitimate evictions with the actual intent of changing the demographics of East Jerusalem, this is it. Now, under Jordanian rule, A large number of Palestinians were, for different reasons, settled in homes that had previously belonged to Jews before the war. Some of the Palestinians were given formal ownership over these homes. Others weren't. Some were given tenancy agreements. Others weren't. And this is when it gets kind of tricky. Because if you try to research why some Palestinians under Jordanian rule got official ownership of these homes from the Jordanian government and others didn't, you'll find that it is very difficult to figure out exactly why. Some of it had to do with the sheer bureaucratic overload that came with trying to settle thousands of Palestinian refugees, both for the Jordanian government and the UN. And some of it had to do with corruption. But the truth is, we don't know for sure. Okay, so fast forward to 1967. Israel was attacked by a coalition of Arab countries, of course primarily Egypt, Syria and Jordan. One of the results of the Six-Day War is that Israel conquers East Jerusalem from Jordan. And when this happened, a lot of the Jews who had owned property in East Jerusalem before 1948 came forward and demanded to get their houses back. And many of them did. However, there were also numerous cases where Palestinians had obtained formal or legal ownership over this property under Jordanian rule, and where Israeli courts then ruled that these Palestinians were allowed to keep their homes. However, in the cases where the Palestinians held no official ownership, the Israelis, the Jews, the pre-1948 owners, that is, they got their houses back. However, and this is where it gets kind of strange actually, Israeli courts ruled that the Palestinians, and this was particularly the case for the people living in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in East Jerusalem, could be allowed to keep living in their homes. They just had to pay rent to the Jewish owners, of course. As long as they did that, they couldn't be thrown out. A frankly crazy concept known as protected tenancy. The only problem was that a lot of people ended up not paying rent for years and even for decades. Some Palestinian families literally paid no rent to the Jewish owners from the late 1960s and until 2021 when they were evicted. And because of their protected tenancy, which is of course again a completely immoral concept, because of course anyone should be allowed to decide who gets to live on their property. Because of this, it was extremely difficult for the owners to throw out their tenants. Until 2021, where several Israeli court decisions allowed for the evictions of specific Palestinian families who had not paid rent, which of course in many cases still did not happen, as it just resulted in a number of new legal battles, because it resulted in a violent clash between Israel and Hamas, as we heard earlier, because it resulted in further pressure from the international community. And here we go, back to 2021, where a house owner trying to throw out a tenant who doesn't pay rent becomes framed as intended ethnic cleansing, as material for Hamas to fire rockets into Israel, as material for Mahmoud Abbas. We'll take a look at this psycho in another video, to start a war in order to find a far-fetched excuse to not hold elections in the West Bank. You gotta love the Middle East.